Welcome today to our conversation with Dr. David Rankin. He wrote the book, an excellent book, What Every American Needs to Know About Economics. This stuff is important. And I read the book a couple weeks ago, and I had actually forgotten that you had written the book. And then I started seeing stuff on Facebook, and that's what prompted me to contact you so that we could maybe have this conversation. So I'm very, very appreciative for you taking me up on the offer. I'll tell a little bit in his book here. It gives his bio, so I was going to read that. It says, Dr. David F. Rankin is President Emeritus at Southern Arkansas University. He's been a professor at SAU for many years and has taught thousands of students in his field of economics and finance. He holds a BSBA in Management from the University of Arkansas, an MBA in Finance from Louisiana Tech University, and a PhD in Finance from the University of Mississippi. Dr. Rankin also holds a Chartered Financial Analyst, CFA, designation. He has served as economic advisor to the Governor of Arkansas and chairman of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors for the past 22 years, having been appointed by then Governor Mike Huckabee in '96. He has been recognized by the Freedoms Foundation and the Americanism Educational League for excellence in free market education, and is current chairman of the Golden Triangle Economic Development Council. He's married to Tony, and they have 3 children, Curtis, Beth Ann, who's here with us today, and John. And you're a pillar of the community. We appreciate all you've done for our community, and welcome to our conversation. And I know it's going to be a good one. So,
well, thank you. It's been great to be here and be involved with the university and the community over the years. It's been a great place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just by way of introduction, why did you write this book? What drove you to write this?
That's about at least 25 years worth of experience in the classroom, where you're trying to make sometimes complicated concepts understandable to the students, and also trying to shoo away some of the economic myths and misunderstandings that can confuse people when they start talking about economics. Because economics is really fairly predictable. There are certain things that work, there are certain things that don't work, and I tried to pull all that together and get most of the topics people are interested in one book.
Well, I think you did a very good job in selecting, because it was I found myself in every chapter thinking, wow, this is so timely and so needed that people would understand. If only people could understand these principles. And so just by way of introduction, some people don't even know, when you say economics, people just think about money. What is economics? How would you define economics?
It's interesting. The definition I ask my students to memorize and understand by rote is, economics is a study of the allocation of scarce resources for the maximum satisfaction of human wants.
Yes.
And I love that, because economic resources are scarce. We all know that. But we want to scatter those around so that they produce the best bang for the buck, or the most production.
Yeah.
The more production you can get out of your resources, the higher the standard of living. And so that's what economics really is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about human action. It's how people allocate those scarce resources.
Exactly.
And we get in a lot of trouble, I think, when we don't recognize that resources are scarce.
And we have countries that are rich in natural resources, but they've never achieved economic greatness.
Yeah.
And yet you have in the United States a country that certainly we have resources, but many countries have resources. But we have achieved economic greatness because of the way we allocate our resources.
Yes, yes. This reminds me of something that I think Milton Friedman talked about. The difference, he contrasted Venezuela and Chile, and the differences in those economies, where Venezuela, rich, all the oil you could ever want, yet what are we seeing in Venezuela versus Chile, which is not nearly as much in resources.
And of course, Venezuela today is a total basket case.
Yeah, absolutely. So why is it important? Why is it important for everyday Americans to know about economics, real practically? Why is it important for them to understand this?
To me, the key to this is the fact that economic policy, which we talk about every day, we see it on the news, we watch the business channels. Economic policy has an impact on freedom. And we have to be careful that if we undertake economic policy that reduces our freedom, then we're not going to be happy with the future. So every time somebody comes up with a great idea, a national leader, and says, let's do this, oh, that sounds great. You think, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to sacrifice some of my freedom for that, like nationalized health care. If you have nationalized health care, great, you're going to get some care provided for you, but what freedoms are you going to give up? Are you going to be told which doctor you have, which hospital you have to go to, how long you're going to have to wait for a certain procedure, things of this nature, what drugs you can actually take. Yeah. And so it's important people to understand that economic policy and freedom are seriously related.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are some people who would try to draw a distinction, like and look at China, say, and they would say, well, China's got lots of economic freedom, but they don't have very much personal freedom. What would you say to that, and for people who may point to China as a model?
Well, that's an example. I have a friend who is from China, and he said before the freedoms were instituted that he and his family were about to starve to death. But after that, we allowed some free enterprise, private property ownership, and things of that nature, that things changed. Yes, so it shows that freedom is a huge advantage. But then freedoms stop at a certain point when a national government has the power, the coercive power that they can use on people. Yes. And of course, when you look at communism and you look at fascism, the coercion is, it's the gun and the knife and the gulag, and that's the way that works. Yeah. So China is free in some respects, but in other respects it's not. And we like the whole panoply of freedom here in the United States, and we want to keep it.
And that's one of the things that makes us so unique as a country, is we're founded on individual freedoms and liberty, and every generation has the opportunity, indeed the duty, I think, to try to protect those things. It. So yeah, absolutely. In chapter 1 of your book, the very first chapter, it says, "How many isms do you understand?" is the name of the first chapter. And in this, you talk about Ludwig von Mises and how he observed that there are two methods for the conduct of affairs within the frame of human society: peaceful cooperation among men. One is bureaucratic management. The other is profit management. And so this chapter, you talk about force versus freedom. Right. And so what's so wrong about organizing society around force?
Well, in Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in the 70s, and he said there's only one alternative to free markets: force. Some people telling other people what to do. Yeah. The problem with what I would call centralized force in a centralized government is that who's controlling that force? That's the key. Yeah. Who controls it? I'll never forget, we were sitting around the university coffee table one afternoon, and where there was a time when the country was kind of in an economic mess, and there was a little pause in the conversation. Somebody said, "What we need is a benevolent dictator." Yeah. And there was a little pause, and I piped up and said, now to find a benevolent dictator. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the key. When you have force concentrated, generally in a central government, somebody's going to be in control of that force, and that somebody may not be pleasant. Yeah, yeah. Well,
we've seen this. That made me think of a very recent example of this in Seattle. You had this militant group, kind of take over the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And what happened? There was a power vacuum that was created, and then what happened? Immediately, you had basically a warlord declare that he had control over it.
Someone is going to take over in a situation like that.
So I think they may have been aiming for 1776, but really they landed among Lord of the Flies. I think is more how it actually turned out. So
and that brings up the very fact, and I mentioned in my book, that one of the keys to economic growth and development is an orderly society. And what we have today, we're seeing some disorder in some of our major cities. Yeah. And one of the other points I make is that an orderly society depends upon a justice system that's correct, a police system, fire system. And so we're defunding the very organizations and individuals that help provide the order. If you don't have order, it's like we go to Venezuela. You don't have order down there. Sure. The economy is really in terrible shape. Sure. Yeah. And wherever you find that, economic growth is going to be zero or negative.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to have, and I think it was Barry Asmus. He told me about the book.
I remember that.
Yeah, he told me about the book that was it Hernando de Soto, I think, wrote one. I can't remember, but anyway, that was one of his main points in his book, is that capitalism works primarily because of private property rights. In order to have those, you have to have a system in place to protect those rights.
Exactly. So, and private property is one of the keys to a free market system, where people can own their own property, they own their own materials and assets. And without that, then you have a classic example is Russia. Russia's had ample resources. I've got all that petroleum. and it should be a rich country. But when you actually look outside the big cities, you see a lot of poverty and a lot of lack of economic development there because those resources have not been managed properly.
Yeah, no, not at all. I remember hearing a story of we're going to talk about prices probably here in a minute, I think, but whenever you have a centralized government like that controls the buying and selling, they have to set prices, and so a lot of times they will borrow from free markets to see what the prices are over there to set their own prices. And it's just
exactly,
it's just so fun. Why don't you just let the price mechanism work?
Classic example. when I was in Russia in 1991. It was a situation where they still had lines for meat and bread and milk in Moscow, and it's just amazing to see that when you come to the United States. As I mentioned in my book, we'd be all been out of shape. We had to wait an extra 2 or 3 minutes, and they're waiting for hours for the basics. Now, when they bought the basics, the prices were very low, but then there was no incentive to create the basics. And I have to tell the story it's in the book there about the story of a visiting American economics professor, and he was observing the slow pace of work in Russia. And so he asked one of the workers, he said, "Why do you work so slow?" And he said, "Well, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us." And that in this country, that doesn't work. People are out there working hard and trying to develop their skills and their abilities and their business.
Well, it reminds me of a quote from a recent presidential candidate who said, "What's wrong with bread lines? People are lining up for that's good, but that's." I don't think he's quite getting it. In America, people line up to give us bread. In other countries, they have to line up to get it, and it's just doesn't go well.
We saw that back during the Great Depression when basically the government, the Federal Reserve System, let all the banks fail. We can talk about that later.
We'll get to that. We've kind of already covered this, but one of the questions I had was, what are some of the things that the government does that are desirable for a free society? So we've already kind of talked about having order, having a system that protects individual rights. Anything else? Any further?
It's like national defense. National defense is one of the key elements because you've got to have your country safe from foreign attack, and that's key. I mentioned the police, obviously. Just order. When you load up a truck out in front of your business, you want it to get to where it's going. You don't want it to be hijacked and have all the merchandise stolen.
Right.
You want airports to be adequate to handle air traffic because that facilitates commerce. You want the highways to be outstanding so commerce can move. So what government should do at its best is set a framework. A framework. But then, like Thomas Jefferson said, other than keeping us from hurting each other, let us do what we want to. And then people are energized to create businesses and to try to produce a better product. And we see that all the time. So government should set the framework. It should not get involved in the game.
So it's pitting greed versus greed, right? So it acknowledges that, we act in our own self-interest. I mean, it just acknowledges that basic.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No,
there's nothing wrong with that.
No, there's not. That's in fact, it's a virtue.
It is as long as it's done within the legal framework.
Yes.
As long as it's ethical and legal. Then when people act in their own self-interest, they benefit all of us.
It's to our benefit that Bill Gates worked in his own self-interest in creating Microsoft. There may be some other stuff we don't like about it, but in creating Microsoft, I mean, just think about the productivity that he unlocked. I mean, I know you remember how it was typing papers. I never had that experience, but
I remember my first computer at SAU was an Apple IIe. And they criticize people like Bill Gates and others who've made a lot of money, but most of their wealth is in their company. And their company is the economic juggernaut that creates all the jobs and the benefits that we enjoy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm afraid a lot of people bite the hand that feeds them without unknowingly.
Exactly.
Why is competition so important?
It's key.
Yeah.
None of us particularly like it. But it's good for us because it causes us to work harder. People will stay up late at night trying to figure out how to make a better product or how to provide a better service or how to have their employees be more friendly to the customers that come in. And competition will basically weed out the inefficient, and it will it'll encourage the efficient. And I think that's why you see companies like Walmart, and you see companies like J.B. Hunt, and all of Apple Computer. That's why, because they have worked harder, they've been more efficient. All of the other companies dropped by the wayside, and we've all benefited.
Absolutely.
Now, I will say this, you have to be careful about monopolies. When one company controls the whole marketplace, that's not good, because they will get fat and lazy in the middle.
Sure.
So we've got to keep competition moving.
I think it was Milton Friedman who even said one of his points is that most natural monopolies, there aren't very many natural monopolies, but the ones that do exist, a lot of times, are propped up by the government.
So just like AT&T, we thought it was a natural monopoly till we found out it wasn't.
Yeah.
We called it back in the day. We'd call it a natural monopoly, but it didn't have to be.
And that brings us. This wasn't in the questions, but one of the things is regulation and how that can stifle business. So maybe talk about that for a second.
If you send 1,000 bureaucrats to Washington and you tell them to regulate something, that's what they're going to do. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. And that's just the way that works. You have to be really careful. We did a little video in front of the stoplight out here at US 7982, and that's a perfect example of government regulation. Because you pull up it keeps confusion from happening. But you can turn right, you can turn left, you can go straight. But if you go down there and put a sign, you can only go straight here, all of a sudden that has confused the flow of traffic. If you put a tax collector in the middle of it, taking $1 every time you come through, that's going to confuse. Decisions are going to change. So you want government to play the referee. Here are the rules, but we're not going to play the game with you. So many times government decides it wants to play the game. And when that happens, inefficiencies are serious.
Yeah, absolutely. Because and to me it's always a good example to show if the free market doesn't produce it, then why does the government need to try to jump in there and get it? A lot of times when they do that, they have to put so many onerous regulations on their competition, to keep them from being a fair competitor to them. So,
and many times some of these government regulations, regulatory groups get controlled by business and industry, which then tries to make it work for their benefit. We've seen that happen before.
Oh, absolutely. That's why lobbying is such a lucrative business, and businesses are incented to engage in it, as much as you can, because
it's in your best interest to do so.
Yeah, it's one of the best investments you can make. It's unfortunate that we live in that kind of situation. It's a dirty game, but if you don't play it, you're the chump.
Get left behind.
That's right. Yeah. Hopefully, though, those of us that do participate in it do it, for the right reasons and get the good things.
Certainly, it's not all bad. It does provide information to people who are making decisions. But again, it can turn into a money game.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Another thing, how do we quantify demand from individuals? And then to contrast, how do we quantify demand from collectives? So you said earlier that individuals have infinite desires or infinite demand. But always the problem is the scarcity of the resources that are out there. I want a yacht. You want a yacht.
Exactly.
If there was no monetary barrier to it, we'd want everything.
Exactly. Well, we all have great wants. By the way, collectives, I will say this in terms of particularly corporate power, can be used and abused on occasion, because individuals, when you're an individual, you can make your own particular choices. But if you have a large corporation, let's say, that's really influential, sometimes they can make decisions and throw their weight around in areas that are not particularly that valuable to the ordinary citizen. So that's a little bit of a concern, because you have governmental power, you have corporate power. Of course, governmental power, like the central government of the United States of America, is huge. It's bigger than countries, big countries. And so it's been well said that the greatest threat to freedom is a concentration of power, whether or not it's in the corporate sector or in the governmental sector. So we have to be careful about that.
Absolutely.
That's why I like the 50 states.
Yeah.
As 50 states, we are the United States of America. We're not the Federal Republic of America. We're the United States of America. So states have influence, and we've seen that here recently with the virus, that governors do have an influence, and I like that, because that kind of diffuses the power. Yeah,
and it lets you, it's like if you were going to be a scientist about it, wouldn't you want 50 labs working on the problem at the same time? And then you could look and see.
And people doing different things.
Yeah, you could see which ways work and which ones don't.
Exactly.
So
This is why it's that one size fits all that we tend to try to do from the federal government is not really a good policy in many cases.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was the whole idea, I think,
Exactly.
of having a federalist, system. So, on control. Well, I was going to read a quote here. It says, "We all know that human wants are insatiable and unlimited. We need to remember that the wants of government fall into the same category. Government, particularly a central government, seems to always want more resources and to develop all kinds of reasons as to why this is a good idea," which is what you basically just said. It's one thing if we get these resources as a result of the growth of the economy. It's another thing if the share of the economy in citizens' hands begins to shrink. This involves a loss of freedom.
Exactly.
And so I believe you're talking there about just the growth of the state and how it has just kind of insidiously grown over time. Where I remember at the turn of the century, the take of the government in terms of GDP was low single digits.
3%.
Yeah.
3% in the early part of the 1900s.
Yeah, I mean, versus where we at now,
About
19.
eight times that size, around 20 and 20 plus percent.
Yeah.
A lot of the European countries, it's closer to 50%.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, that's just the federal part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the concentration of power can be a real serious thing, and it's natural for someone to say, "How about free college?
Yeah.
How about free Medicare,
Yeah.
medicine?" All of those things, they sound so good.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is they involve a tremendous expansion of government power. They involve a tremendous expansion of spending and borrowing, but it sounds so good. And so that's what it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
They just lead us down that road, and when we get to the end of the road, we're not going to like it.
Yeah. Well, it's like if the idea was so good, why don't we do that, voluntarily? That's always to me like, why do you have to force everybody to do it? If it's such a good idea, why do you have to pull the guns out and force people to buy into your idea? So how particularly has the government centralized control?
Well, I think there's been a tremendous, I'll tell you this, it's been the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. And if you want to go back to 1913 and realize that we passed that amendment to the Constitution, and what that says is the federal government, the central government, will have an opportunity, the ability, the authority to lay an income tax on the population without any distribution to the states.
Yeah.
So the 16th Amendment basically allowed the federal government to come in and grab a huge share of the national income, take it to Washington, D.C., and that's why you have those huge buildings up there, all of those government employees. If it wasn't for the 16th Amendment, that wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Now, some of that money comes back because they do give some money back to the states in various forms.
If they play well, if they
But
obey.
you do it according to their rules.
You obey them.
They have the money,
Yeah.
so they send it back with their rules.
Yeah.
It would have been so much better if there had been some apportionment to the states and let the governors and the states and the legislatures make some difference. That's been the biggest thing that really has moved us away from a decentralized system to a centralized system in the United States.
They have to follow. It's that one-size-fits-all thing. If you don't play by their rules, they can withhold those funds from you.
Exactly.
And it works both ways. And we've seen some of that of late. That the fallout of this is that whoever is in D.C. has so much more power over all the states and can allocate resources. Because just take New York for instance. There was a big fight in Congress about. They're in terrible shape fiscally, but it's from years of mismanagement probably. But unlike the federal government, New York can't print more dollars.
Exactly.
And so, they now I don't agree obviously with the way they have been profligate in their spending and mismanaged, because Arkansas is very has a very good record on fiscal issues.
Exactly.
Relatively speaking. We operate under a balanced budget, and most states have that, don't they?
Most do. We have the Revenue Stabilization Act, which says the governor cannot spend more money than comes in. So what the governor does, and when I was in higher education for many years, if the money didn't come in, we get a letter from the governor, and he says, "Dear David, the money didn't come in. You're going to get 5% less money than we expected. Good luck."
Yeah, right.
That's the way that works.
Yeah.
But that's reasonable. That's the way it works in our own families. If our incomes decline, then we're going to have to cut the budget. But the federal government, no. They have unlimited borrowing capacity, and you can see we have spent now, just in the last few months, $3 trillion are in the process of spending that. Yeah. We obviously don't have it. Where are we going to get it? We're going to borrow the money. Who are we going to borrow it from? The Federal Reserve System,
yeah,
and some others.
Yeah.
And down the road now, it'll all come home to roost. But right now, we can do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get there. I got a question on that. Let's see. What should policies be judged on? So as we consider a policy, how should we judge them whether or not they're a good policy?
To me, the first thing is freedom. Okay. Is this a policy that takes away individual freedom? Because when this country was founded, we valued individual freedom as very, very important. Yeah. And so if it takes away individual freedom, I think it ought to throw up a red flag just to start with. Because you could get into the issues of efficiency and all of that, and when you get into those areas, it just depends on who's making those comments. Yeah. But I think if we look at them on the basis of freedom, give us the freedom to let people do what they want to do, as long as they're not harming someone else. Let them do what they want to do in their daily lives and in their business and their activities and occupations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why doesn't price fixing work? In your book, you talk about minimum wage and other things.
Yes.
So, and minimum wage is basically price fixing for labor.
That's correct.
So why doesn't price fixing work? I mean, it sounds good. It's one of those things that sounds good. But
sounds good.
Why doesn't that work?
It leaves out the market. Yeah. The market supply and demand should set the price of nearly everything. With regard to the minimum wage in Arkansas in January went to $10 an hour here in Arkansas. The only problem with that is the cost of living here in Arkansas is about half what it is in New York City.
Right.
So our minimum wage of $10 is equivalent to $20 an hour in New York City. So we basically have said, in comparison to New York City or Boston, Massachusetts, that we're setting our minimum wage at $20 an hour. What this does is price unskilled young workers out of the market, because a lot of the time, not only is it $10 an hour, but you have to add the Social Security onto it also, and get that number and get it up. It's about $11 an hour that it's going to cost you. Plus, the first few weeks, the employees there, they're probably worth $2 an hour.
If that,
in fact, they may cost
negative,
you more. It's probably negative.
Yeah.
So those things, it sounds really good. They will raise the minimum wage, but that creates a surplus of workers, those young workers that never get that chance. And you never know how a first job will change someone's life.
Right. I mean, this is what I always think about whenever I think about this issue. Let's say you got a guy that really wants a job. He's fresh out of high school, or maybe he's still in high school, and he just wants some work. And he comes to me and says, hey, I'd love a job. And I'll have to say to him, I'm sorry, I just can't do it. I'll work for you for $5 an hour. Now, without minimum wage, I might be willing to take a risk on him and let him prove himself.
And let him work a week or two and see if he's going to be productive.
But because of minimum wage, that is illegal. It's illegal for me to enter into an agreement with this young man who wants an opportunity. So it just kills some people, and it's not very many, but why would you impose something that would hurt anybody?
Exactly. I have a story about a gentleman that ended up being a vice president at a bank, and during the Great Depression, he went to the bank as a young man and said, look, I'll work for you for nothing for 2 months.
Yeah.
Then if you like my work, hire me. If you don't, no problem.
Yeah.
He went to work for 2 months. They liked him, hired him, became vice president of the bank, retired as vice president. Yeah. Those are the kind of things that, if I wanted to go to work for you for $8.50 an hour, why can't I do that?
Right.
I'm an American citizen. Don't we have freedom?
Yeah.
But you say, well, they're taking advantage of you. No, not if that will help me. You take a retired person, if they could go to work for $9 an hour and add to their Social Security, it would give them something to do. They would use their energies and activities. They might double their income.
Yeah.
So it is important to understand that freedom is an issue. We could raise our minimum wage to $50 an hour.
Yeah.
If you could go over to some poor country and say, this country is really poor, let's raise the minimum wage $50 an hour and make everybody wealthy.
Yeah.
Well, you would destroy the economy of the country.
Right, exactly. I think it's a problem of the seen and the unseen. Whenever they raise the minimum wage, they'll hold up these few people. See, look, this guy, he was making $8 an hour, and all of a sudden he's making $10. What you don't see is the guy that never gets the job.
That's right.
Because his skill level is only at $7 or $8 an hour.
Some of the people that are out demonstrating for $15 an hour minimum wage, national minimum wage, don't realize that if that actually happened, they would probably be let go. It wouldn't make a big deal of it,
right.
but they would just say, well, we just don't need your services anymore because you're less productive.
Yeah.
So we cut the less productive out. We don't give them a chance to get their foot on the first rung of the ladder and get moving up.
And I think a lot of people hear this and they think, well, that just sounds cruel.
Exactly.
But it's not. No. Why is it not cruel?
It provides opportunity.
Yes.
You could end up starting at $8 an hour somewhere and end up opening a company in 20 years, something like that. Yeah. It's so many young people, like college students, have started working for companies in the summer or something like that, and then they end up getting a job. They may end up being the CEO of the company. I think opportunity to learn and to work. That's the key.
Absolutely. It's unfortunate because we do have free work programs, and they're called internships sometimes. So you can work. So you can work for $0, or you have to, or your output has to be at $10 an hour. So what about all those people in between? I mean, it just cuts all those people out that might otherwise have opportunities.
Exactly. So and prices work that way. It's anytime you do something to the price. If you raise the price higher than the market, you're going to end up with surplus. If you try to keep it low, then you're going to end up with a shortage. That's exactly what happened in Russia. The prices were low, but then there were shortages because you didn't let the price provide the incentive to produce the product and deliver it to the consumer.
Yeah, why would they? I don't want to get into a discussion on price gouging because that's the way people would say that. But the pricing mechanism tells people what people value.
It transmits information.
And
if you don't allow it to transmit information, the information doesn't get to where it needs to be, and the corrective action doesn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And so we've seen shortages in just recently in the pandemic of personal protective equipment, PPE, and stuff like that. And I know there has been rises and falls in prices, but they've really tried, I think, to keep prices down. And they'll say that these people that are charging these high prices are bad, but really those pricing signals are telling us, hey, we need more PPE.
We need more of it.
We need more PPE.
And if you don't allow the price to fluctuate, then you have to allocate.
Yeah.
You have to allocate because one person will come in and buy it all out. Then they'll go outside and they'll sell it for higher prices. So you have to allocate or ration. That's what happened during World War II with gasoline and things like that. We rationed those products during the war. Yeah, we saw. I mean, had you let prices rise, we would have never had a shortage. Like on alcohol, for instance. I mean, I was one of those that went around and bought a few bottles, maybe 3 or 4 bottles of it. But now they've put a limit. You can only buy a couple bottles of it, and that's one way to do it. Making hand sanitizer, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. Because we've got all our employees and the stuff that we're trying to do here to keep people safe, and if you didn't do it, somebody else is going to buy it, and that's just the incentive is to just load up on it, buy as much as you can.
I know, and then the shelves are empty, and somebody comes in that really needs it, and it's not there.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just a sad thing. One of the things that you cover, and I really appreciate that, and I don't know if I think my fair tax book is over on my shelf over there, but I'm a big proponent of the fair tax, which is the consumption tax. I don't know if it looked like you had read maybe you'd read that book from some of the stuff you said in there. That you would turn April 15th into just another spring day or something like that.
Exactly.
But what is the difference between we've already kind of bemoaned the fact that there's an income tax. What would be different or better about a consumption tax versus an income tax? Not adding it to, but replacing it with.
And that's what they've done in Europe. They have added the consumption tax to the income tax. The reason the income tax, if you had a flat income tax, that would be much better than what we have. But right now we have a graduated income tax. The top bracket is 39.6%. And then some cities like New York City have a lot more to stack on top of it. So you can end up with a 50% income tax on certain portions of your income.
Right.
The consumption tax, I get in trouble and people argue with me. I call it a national sales tax because that's what it is. It's a value-added tax. They tax it at each level of production. But the impact is a national sales tax. But when you get to the cash register, you don't see it.
Right.
You would just see the price of the product. In that product is going to be the tax, and then you have the state tax on top of it. So it's really a sneaky national sales tax, a value-added tax.
Yeah.
The advantage this would be is only when you spent money would you pay the tax. A lot of people think that your income determines your standard of living. And that's the case many times. But many times else it's not.
Yeah.
Because we've all seen people that spend way less than their income, and they may save the difference for whatever reason, but their income is here, but they're saving here. And so that what they're spending, that is their standard of living, whatever it might be.
Right,
so in terms of the standard of living, they would be equal to someone else who's spending that same amount of money because they're all paying the consumption tax.
Right,
I don't think it'll ever happen.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll ever happen. It's considered to be a regressive tax.
Right.
But I think that it would be much superior to the income tax.
Well, I think in Neil Bortz, he wrote a book called The Fair Tax, and there's a bill. I forget the number of the bill, but there's a bill sitting somewhere in Congress that would implement the consumption tax. And the way they would deal with some of those issues is they would offer a monthly prebate. I don't know if you saw that, but that would help offset. So basically, you would untax the people below the poverty level.
It would also pick up on the illegal income. Because people that are spending illegal income obviously are not paying the income tax, and they're not going to.
Right.
But they would be paying the consumption tax.
Or
so that's an advantage.
Yeah, or if you go buy all the alcohol bottles and then sell them, sell them out on the black market, it would capture that eventually. So I think it would be. I think the danger would be. It would have to be done with much fear and trembling, I think, to not let it be just another tax
an
that we
add-on.
add.
See, that's what's going to happen down the road, I think, because as we begin to stack up these trillions and trillions of dollars, and we're soon going to be talking about tens of trillions of dollars worth of additional debt, then somebody's going to have to say, how are we going to pay the interest on it and still meet Social Security payments? And when that happens, they're going to be looking at the value-added tax or the consumption tax.
Or, well, here's another thought I had, and this is we're getting into this point. What if they just, there've been, I'm afraid they're going to do this. I'm not saying they should, but I'm just afraid they're going to do this. Right now, the way it works is Congress will appropriate a bill, they will send it to the Treasury. The Treasury will issue debt. The debt is purchased by big banks and the Fed, and then that money is ultimately bought by the Fed a lot of the times, probably here recently for sure. But they'll send a check back to the Treasury to spend the money on the things that the bills have been passed to spend the money on. So I just foresee a time when we're going to quit the charade and maybe the Treasury will issue like new currency. Maybe they'll send like $2 trillion over to the Fed to pay off the debt, that we owe. Or the Fed will be willing to purchase this debt at a much lower rate than the market. So that may be a way to fix the interest rates by, raising $10 trillion in debt at 1% for 50 years or something.
I know. It's the money tree.
Yeah.
And it's going right now. I don't think it's going to be inflationary right now because basically we have sucked trillions of dollars out of the economy with the shutdown.
Yeah.
And then the federal government is putting trillions of dollars back into the economy.
Right.
With the CARES Act and various versions of that. But down the road, if we continue to do this sort of thing, that's what's going to happen. And we're going to build up inflationary pressures. The interest percentage of the federal debt is particularly, right now we have almost zero interest rate.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to be forever.
No.
And when that changes, the portion of the federal government budget going to interest is going to be tremendous.
I'm just wondering, though, if the Fed will make a deal to just be willing to purchase debt at a much lower rate than market rate.
I don't know.
Why
is this possible?
I'm just thinking that they might have to do that. Like that, you just might be in a situation where, like you say, if they let the rates go up with the market, it's just going to be it's already unworkable anyway. This is unsustainable. The course we're on.
Long term.
So
yes.
long term.
I have a good friend of mine who's an economist. He said the United States is going broke. It's just going to take a long time.
Yeah.
And it is going to take more. Right now, our debt is about 100% of our gross domestic product, but it'll get to the 200% and maybe 300%. We can probably manage 200% or a little better, but once it gets much beyond that, then you're really skating on thin ice.
Yeah. So what's the fallout? What do you see happening eventually? If that, it could be 20 years, it could be 200 years, it could be 5 years, maybe. Probably not. But.
Most of the governments who have gone through that process end up with runaway inflation.
Yeah.
That's the way it's happened in most countries.
Yeah.
And it takes some monetary consistency really to squeeze inflation out, like in 1980 recession, 1981-82, where the Fed basically squeezed the economy, got inflation out of it. So I'm really concerned long term it'll be very inflationary. The government's just throwing money out there to trying to keep the wheels turning, and
Yeah.
it leads to increased prices.
Yeah. I think that's very likely, and I think this is a $10 trillion. You didn't know you were speaking to a 10 trillionaire, did you?
No, I didn't.
So yeah,
That's
there's my
that's great.
Zimbabwean $10 trillion bill.
Okay,
So.
absolutely. Well, these things have happened, and as you see right here, and it could happen in the United States. That's why we have to be careful. We can't just assume that the federal government can continue to spend way above its means and it'll go on forever. It won't.
Yeah. There's a payday someday, as they say. So
no, it's not yet, but down the road.
The road. Yeah. I mean, there's got to be a payday. I mean, we've got to pay for our
one thing we can do to kind of moderate the problem is we've got to get the economic growth rate back. I mean, we were growing nicely up until the virus hit. We've got to get the economy growing. If we can get the economy growing, then that helps with federal government revenues.
Sure.
Obviously, their revenues are higher in a growth economy, so that's the key.
Yeah.
And the federal government has not shown itself able to cut expenditures. What you have to hope is the economic growth will be fast enough so that the federal government can still grow, but not at an exponential rate.
Yeah.
That's what we're looking for.
So what would be your prescription for fix it? Like if you were dictator for a day, but let's say within reason. I mean, obviously there'd probably be a whole lot of stuff we'd wave our magic wand. But what do you think are some reasonable things that have a possibility of getting implemented that could help?
If we would just take the virus off the table and take all of that and say it's a normal year, I think we ought to run it the same way the state governments do. You call your department chairs in and you say, okay, guys and gals, you're going to have 5% less money in the new budget than you had last year. You figure out how to make that work.
Right.
I'm not going to do that. You figure out how to make it. It's what the governor tells us. Yeah. And that can work. That's the only way you can slow it down, because as long as you have this endless flow of cash, it's just a money machine. It'll never stop.
Yeah. Money printer go brr. I don't know if you've seen those pictures.
Exactly.
But it's just amazing. Because again, kind of like individuals, these people that get in power in government, and I have sympathy for them. Because in their minds, they think, well, if I don't twist this knob, if I don't do this thing that I have the power to do, and something happens, it's on me, and I don't get reelected, and I've lost power. So there's some perverse incentives for people to spend way more than would be reasonable. And,
yes, they kick the can down the road because they know they won't be down there to have to deal with the issue in the future.
Right, exactly. In one of in the final chapter, I believe, or one of the last chapters of your book, you talk about health savings accounts and specifically on medical costs. What do you think? In my book, I wrote a chapter on HSAs, and I talk about a strategy of how to use them, and I think they're just an amazing tool. I wish more people would use them. So, what is so good about an HSA?
The thing I love about an HSA is once you save that money, it goes into the account. It's yours, and you can use it for medical expenses, but it stays yours, and also begins to bring home the idea of some relationship to cost. Because right now in our healthcare system now, we don't think about the cost. We go to the hospital, they say, do you want this or that or the other? We say, well, sure, yes, absolutely, because there's no relationship to cost for us as insurance policy holders. The HSA, I think, get a major medical, which doesn't cover the smaller stuff down here. It covers the big stuff, not the smaller stuff. Then you invest in the HSA, that covers the smaller stuff, and you might actually ask, hey, Doc, how much is this going to cost?
Right, yeah. You'll care about pricing then.
Because then you're spending your own money.
You got to write a check.
Exactly.
And
you provide tax incentives to create the HSA. I think it's really, I would love to see, many times the government does not give the kind of incentives we need. I'd love to see every medical expense that's not covered by your insurance deductible off your income tax, everything, from premiums and all of these sorts of things. That would be a real boost, I think, to make it more attractive.
Yeah, I just think it's such an underutilized tool. I really don't understand why more people don't use it, because it's really just the best of both worlds. Money goes in tax-free, and then when you use it to pay for your medical expenses or to reimburse yourself for medical expenses, you get it out tax-free.
Exactly.
And so there's some strategies, like one of the strategies I talk about in my book is, if you can, and not everybody can do this, but if you can, put your money in your HSA and don't spend it out of the HSA. If you can, spend money out of your pocket to pay for your medical expenses, and then save your receipts for your expenses, and then you can reimburse yourself at any time in the future for your expenses.
Okay.
So it's there's all kinds of strategies you can use for that. So it can really become like another retirement fund for you.
The thing, it's in keeping with freedom too, because you are making some decisions.
Yeah.
The individual is making some decisions with their own money, and that's always superior to having someone else make a decision for you.
Yeah. That reminds me of Milton Friedman talking about the 4 ways you can spend money. You can spend your money on yourself. You can spend your money on somebody else. You can spend somebody else's money on yourself, or you can spend somebody else's money on somebody else.
Exactly.
And that's a declining incentive to do well with the money.
That's right. And anyone who's listening to this and has not read Free to Choose by Milton Friedman ought to do that. Even though it was written about 1979 or 80, it is still current today in so many respects.
Absolutely.
He was a good 25 to 40 years ahead of his time. One of the most brilliant people I've ever met.
And for those for maybe the millennials and the younger people, just get on YouTube and start looking for Milton Friedman and just go down that rabbit hole, because he's one of those rare intellectuals, I think, who was so personable. I mean, he's just a delight to listen to. I mean, I remember when I kind of started getting into this stuff 15 years ago or so, I would spend hours, watching Milton Friedman videos on YouTube and just watching him talk, because he made it easy to agree with him. And I think that's one of the things that's so lacking in our corporate dialogue today, is that we do not make it easy for people to agree with us. We set up egos.
Exactly.
We set up, we make people dig in. So like right now, there's a thing. This is very timely. The whole mask debate. Like, should we be wearing masks? Should we not be wearing masks? Well, I mean, I think masks. It looks like to me from the data that masks help in a lot of situations. But if you make it about ego, if you make it about if you don't wear a mask, you're stupid. Well, that's not going to help.
Exactly.
It's not going to help.
We're having fights in restaurants now.
Yeah.
We had one over the weekend, and so that's there again. You get emotions get out of control.
Yeah. So I appreciate these kind of conversations we have, though we agree pretty much on everything, I think. But hopefully this will spur other people to think more about economics and how important it is. It's such an important thing.
It is, and economic policy is related to freedom, and it's important to understand that freedom is really the core of the United States of America. And when we move away from that, we have sacrificed some important principles.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Rankin, I very much appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I think it's been a good conversation. I think people will benefit from this greatly. And so for those of you who are watching, he wrote this book. It's What Every American Needs to Know About Economics. This stuff is important. And so where can they find this
Go
book?
to davidfrankin.com.
Okay.
And if you want it autographed, you just indicate that when you purchase the book, and I'll autograph it and send you a copy.
Great. Yeah, and it comes in, this is the hardback edition, and I'm going to get you to sign mine, I think, here in a minute.
Oh, absolutely.
But it comes in paperback, too?
It does not. Strictly hardback.
Oh, it's just hardback.
Right.
Okay, yeah. This is the nice one. Mine is just paperback, so maybe one day I'll get there to where I'll get
I think you can get it on Amazon in paperback, but I like the hardback so much.
Oh,
better. That's what we have.
Well, it's a great read, and I was telling him before, if you've got kids and you want them to have a good introduction to economics, I'm going to assign this book to all my kids to read, and I think they will very much enjoy reading this, because it's something. If everybody knew what's in this book, I think we'd be a whole lot better off as a nation.
A step in the right direction, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
Yep.